Perfect. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our 11th episode of our Planet Earthly series. We began Planet Earthly actually a year and a half ago, and it was meant to be a place where we could bring awareness to technical, ecological issues, interventions to a non-technical audience, which Earthly's clients came from, most of them. And we realized that we wanted to kind of create, remove the kind of myths or demystify some of the concepts that emerge in the very dynamic carbon and nature markets. We've had a very good, successful track record with our webinars. We've had a range of speakers, and today we bring our 11th episode. And we're really glad that all of you could join us today. The ecosystem space, especially in the UK, and biodiversity has been a very emerging and relevant topic in the past couple of months, but also since the Das Gupta review came up. So we felt that this was something that we wanted to kind of bring to our audiences and engage in a discussion around it. Jenny, maybe I can have the next slide. So we're joined today by 4 of our very brilliant panelists, each from a different niche and technical expertise, working towards uplifting and restoring the biodiversity in the UK. We have Nick from South Downs National Park Authority, Rob from Environment Bank, Ida Bailey joins us from SLR Consulting, and to kind of bring a landowner's perspective on the kind of evolving biodiversity space, we have Ben from Ilford Estate. I'll share more of an in-depth introduction about our speakers later as we progress with our session, but I wanted to quickly maybe set the stage for why we are talking about biodiversity in the UK and nature in the UK in general. Next slide, please. So in the last couple of years, I think the global attention around declining biodiversity has increased manyfold. That has been partly impacted by the Living Planet Index, for instance, and international reports, which have kind of shown us how a severe decline of species has been going on. So, for example, with the Living Planet Index, we found that it showed that 69% of our species had been declining in the last 4 decades. With this has also kind of lights on the risk and dependencies faced by businesses, but also society for their impacts on nature. And in the UK, the most comprehensive report till date on the state of biodiversity, which is the State of Nature Report 2023, kind of showed how nature was seriously declining across the UK, a country which was already one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And the report showed that almost 1 in 6 species are now threatened with extinction in the UK. And this is kind of a timely reminder because we often think that nature loss or nature crisis is restricted or is more pronounced in places like the Amazon or Great Barrier Reefs, but actually it's right here within our doorsteps. And we're losing familiar wildlife species that we've been cherishing in our UK kind of landscapes, including the decline of our pollinator species, which has not just impacts on agriculture, but also ecosystem servicing. Next slide, please. Having said that, we wanted to kind of highlight how Earthly has always believed that biodiversity and social benefits should always be at the core of every nature project and nature interventions. Existing in a dynamic carbon space, we've often faced carbon projects which are very carbon-heavy lens and not looking at a holistic picture of impacts, which then restricts the long-term benefits and permanence of carbon. So even within Earthly and even within the carbon space, Earthly has been kind of leading the work on holistic kind of project scoring and project assessment, which brought biodiversity into the forefront of carbon projects. Next slide, please. And within this, we've gone into our project assessment framework, which is a tool that we use for assessing our projects. And we go into a lot of granularity on ecosystem benefits, context awareness, nature conservation. And as you can see, this is kind of like a communication piece that we have shared with our clients to raise the awareness of, what are the holistic considerations of biodiversity that one should take when investing in nature projects. So having given you that snapshot of what Earthly has been doing in this space, now we are very, very enthusiastic and excited to see the evolving kind of biodiversity space in the UK. And we are happy to kind of collaborate this discussion today on the state of biodiversity in the UK and why we need high integrity projects to kind of restore the biodiversity in the country. Next slide, please. We have Rob Wreglesworth, who is the principal project advisor for the Environment Bank, and is personally someone I find to be the most engaging actors within the UK biodiversity space, at least on my LinkedIn. Nick, Rob, I've really enjoyed your thoughtful takes on the promises, but also the hard work that will be needed to bring BNG in the UK. So I leave the stage to you and look forward to hearing what you say.
Thanks very much, Banasree. So yes, as said, I'm Rob. I'm an ecologist by training. So I've been at the Environment Bank for around 6 years now. I joined the Environment Bank back in 2019, I think it was, when biodiversity net gain was still in its early stages of development, and we were very involved at the Environment Bank with getting this policy into the legislation, and finally it kind of came in live. You may well be aware now, I'm sure many of you on this call are, of the fact that it came into policy in February this year after quite a few years of lobbying and defining this policy and shaping it. So that gets us to where we are today as a company. We're now one of the leading providers of biodiversity net gain units in England. So we've been working hard behind the scenes for the last couple of years, really trying to get ready for this policy coming into place this year. And we set about looking to set up what we call habitat banks. So these are nature recovery projects, nature restoration projects around England, channeling private finance from this new legislation into nature recovery. And you can see from that map there on screen that we've got around 30 sites live now across the country, spread all around the place. Those dots on that map on the left there, you can see some of our projects. And we take a long-term lease on land with landowners in partnership, and then we contract back the management to those landowners who help us deliver biodiversity gains on those projects. And those gains are realized in the form of these biodiversity net gain units, and those can be used as part of the biodiversity net gain strategy for developers. So developers obviously have to avoid impacts in the first place following the mitigation hierarchy. Then they have to mitigate those impacts on the site, and anything that they can't deliver within the development site itself, they have to find a off-site solution. And that's where Environment Bank come in. We're looking to set up projects all around the country where those developers, depending on where the development is, can look for a local site that is relevant to them, where they can contribute towards some landscape scale nature recovery. So fitting into that net gain strategy. Next slide, please. And we're also looking, so our whole vision at Environment Bank is about channeling more private sector funding into nature restoration in the UK and then beyond. We know from the Global Biodiversity Framework that came out of COP15 in Montreal that there's a huge requirement for more funding into nature recovery and into conservation, and there's actually targets set within that of a 30% increase in private sector funding required into nature restoration by 2030. And there's various ways we can do that, and biodiversity net gain, which I just explained, is one of those ways that we can channel more private sector funding into nature restoration. But we're also at Environment Bank exploring other potential markets, from carbon to emerging nature markets as well. So the voluntary biodiversity credit market, which we'll come on to, I'm sure, in the panel discussion in a bit. But this on the screen here is one of our pilot projects, which is a much larger project than could be funded through biodiversity net gain alone. And it's one we're exploring with the wider corporate market, which we think will be driven by emerging requirements and frameworks that are pushing private companies to measure and account better for their impacts on nature and then to contribute to the restoration of nature as well. Next slide, please. Final bit for me. This is kind of culminating in a piece of work that we're hoping to release in the next month or so, which is our Nature Shares proposition, which is a way of designing these projects for the corporate market in a way that's relevant to them. So looking to work with groups of businesses that want to do large-scale nature restoration or nature conservation projects in the UK or in other geographies as well, that aligns with their business and can deliver for nature as well. So that's just a little teaser of something to keep an eye out for in the coming month or so. So I'll hold there for now.
Thank you, Rob. Moving on to our next panelist, we have Ida Bailey from SLR Consulting. Ida co-leads SLR's Nature Capital team in Europe. She is a PhD and holds a bachelor honors in biodiversity and nature sciences. She's an associate member of SEAM, which is a certified ecological restoration practitioner in training with the Society of Social Ecological Restoration. And she also sits in the panel for academic specialists for the Biodiversity Futures Initiative. She brings roughly 17 years of ecological consultancy and research experience, not only in the UK, but overseas. And she's been specializing in innovative multidisciplinary ecological research. Nature Positive has been contributing to biocredit and natural capital projects over these years. Very nice to have you with us, Ida, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's fantastic to have the opportunity to speak here today. Just a little bit of background to myself and the work we do at SLR before we move on to sort of the panel discussion. So SLR is a large multidisciplinary consultancy, and we work with a range of corporates, both in the ecology space, which many people will be familiar with around EIA, for example, but then also around ESG and sustainability. And it's linking those sustainability clients and the targets that have come out of COP15 through the Global Biodiversity Framework, which I think presents one of the biggest opportunities globally for nature restoration, particularly through some of the targets around agriculture and through Target 15, which focuses on requiring corporates to understand and disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature. And that's up and down their value chains, not just within their operational sites. And it's sort of most of the world's economy, so definitely 50% of it's roughly moderately or highly dependent on nature. But when you drill down, the whole of our world economy and society is dependent on nature, which means that for corporates and investors in corporates, the decline in nature poses really material risks to their businesses, as it does to the rest of us in wider society. And so it's been really positive to see, particularly some of the more forward-thinking organizations really starting to get to grips with this, trying to understand their risks and to set targets moving forward. Most organizations are fairly early stages in this, and of course it's a massive challenge, particularly when you're dealing with organizations which have thousands of suppliers globally, and their suppliers may change year to year, and the on-the-ground locations of where their impacts might be may therefore change year to year. So it's a massive puzzle to be trying to solve, and really rewarding to be engaging with some really positive mindsets, and seeing this nature market as it is emerging alongside the voluntary biocredits and the fantastic progress that's being made in the UK in terms of development projects through the BNG market. So really looking forward to discussing this in more depth on the panel later on today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ida. I think you raised a very important point about, the difficulty of businesses in estimating what their impacts on nature is, understanding their risks, but also their impacts. And I think, collectively, there's a lot of work to be done on that end. Love to speak with you later on that during our panel. But moving on to our next panelist for the day is Ben Taylor, who is the Managing Director of Ilford Estate in the UK. He's the on-ground manager for Ilford Estate and is one of Earthly's collaborators within our Biodiversity UK portfolio. We've been working with Ben to kind of understand, how to bring biodiversity within kind of the emerging UK market. Welcome, Nick, and we would love to hear you talk about, how the awareness around biodiversity uplift is being felt by estate managers and landowners, and how the journey for your team has been navigating this emerging space.
Thank you. So the Ilford Estate is about 1,200 hectares, situated right on the south coast of the UK near Brighton. It's a farming estate, and has been owned by the same family for 125 years. As part of our agricultural journey, we've spent a lot of time looking at how we can best manage the farm for the long term, and we've always had an eye towards our natural capital, if you like, what we've already got on the farm. And over the last 3 years, it's become increasingly clear that agricultural production is challenging on this farm, as it is in a lot of places. And so we started to explore some of the new and emerging markets. About 3 years ago, we started developing our BNG offering. So we've developed an 800 hectare, 2,000 acre vision for what we can do with BNG and nature on this farm. At the moment, we're focusing on biodiversity net gain as a means of delivering that vision, but we're also beginning to explore voluntary credits and other nature markets to try and generate the investment required to deliver that vision. It culminated really last year with the signing of what was the first Section 106 for BNG, I think, in the country. And we're now one of the only sites registered on the Biodiversity Net Gain Register. So we are now live for selling BNG units and engaging with developers and builders in order to satisfy their requirements.
Thank you so much, Ben. Just want to quickly check if Nick has been able to join us. Probably not. In that case, Jenny, why don't we go ahead with the panel discussion? We do have a lot of time before we wrap up. 35 minutes. So I think this is a perfect opportunity to kind of talk a little bit more about, what our speakers touched on in their presentation. I think very quickly opening up with a very easy kind of question is the kind of the question around the declining state of biodiversity. So, oh, so sorry. I quickly lost the screen for a second. Right. The question begets, like, how has UK ended up as one of the most nature depleted countries in the world? But then connecting that story to what Ben, you mentioned, like, within your estate, which has been an agricultural estate for the last 125 years, you noticed that the agricultural yield was getting impacted. How do you think, how do you think that kind of corresponds or reflects on the UK biodiversity, like wider agricultural lens as well within the UK?
I think the challenges that farmers have faced over the last 30 or 40 years have inevitably meant that we've become more intensive, and I think that that's inevitably had an impact on biodiversity. But I don't think it's fair to blame farms entirely. We're responding to very clear economic pressures and very clear stimuli from government, really. That focus is changing slightly now with the introduction of new environmental schemes, but we've responded to the challenges and the legislative framework that we've been operating within. But I think we're all farmers actually want to be able to look after nature and to provide biodiversity. It's just finding the funding and providing that around a viable agricultural business.
And in terms of maybe the evidence around, the lived evidence, like, is there anything within your kind of time managing the Ilford estate that you've seen, the actual impacts of how the biodiversity is declining? I mean, obviously the reduced agricultural yield is one indicator, but have you seen maybe a decline in certain regular biodiversity species or certain indicators that showcases how that trend has been declining over time?
Well, actually, personally, I've experienced the opposite, and I think that our biodiversity is increasing. And it's because we've, over the last 20 or 30 years, created things like margins on the edges of fields that are allowed to go wild areas of the farm that we don't really touch, more food for farmland birds during the winter. And we're seeing the results. Actually, if you provide the habitat, the species do come. And we've certainly, from our survey work, got far more species and far more abundance of those species than we did have when I first started 20 years ago. And that's not to say it's perfect, and it's not to say that there's not improvements that can be made. But I don't personally recognise some of the headlines that I'm seeing. I think it would be fair to say.
Fair enough. I think it's a very case-to-case kind of experience there. We do have landowners who have already started practicing these, nature biodiversity positive actions, like, growing hedgerows and implementing these biodiversity positive steps that has already shown that their impacts can be that visible. So I'm really glad to hear that from you. I think on the kind of impact side, we have already seen, the kind of evidence of biodiversity impact. Ida, I would love to know from you. You talked about kind of, businesses being struggling to understand their risks, or maybe struggling to understand how their dependencies on biodiversity and nature. What are some of the bottlenecks, for example, in helping kind of businesses approach biodiversity dependencies and risks, and what can, stakeholders like ourselves do to kind of bring them more closer to understanding their biodiversity impact?
It's a really interesting and challenging question. I think it depends very much on the corporates. So we might work with anything from a corporate that has quite a big supply chain that is largely agricultural, and for them the challenge is finding out where on the ground, or even in some cases which country those impacts are in. That's really a supply chain tracing issue that will take time to resolve. And I mean, there are ways of looking at it, but it's very different from working with a supplier who knows exactly which farms that they are buying from, and therefore can work with those farmers or that farming community to start implementing some more nature positive practices. And within the UK, that's so important because 71% of our land is agricultural, and there's really good opportunities to create win-wins both for the farming community and for nature and business through making that system more resilient in the long term. And then, of course, you might have clients who are a bit more removed from that direct impact on the ground. For example, maybe somebody who's manufacturing door handles or something, and then that's many more steps down to their impacts and dependencies on nature, and much more difficult for them to start thinking about how they can have a positive impact, because all the way down that supply chain, other people will be thinking in the same way. And I think that's more the situation where, obviously we can encourage them to work with their suppliers where they can, or to choose suppliers with better nature credentials, to do everything they can within the mitigation hierarchy to improve internally their impacts on nature. But the opportunity then perhaps to work with the voluntary biodiversity credit market, not for offsetting, but for that additional add-on nature positive impact, where they can work with a third-party supplier to have a robust, well-measured impact on enhancing biodiversity somewhere that's relevant to them, I think is a good emerging option. And I'm working on a couple of projects currently in that sort of voluntary biocredit space.
I think you've raised such an important point. Understanding their supply chain, being able to kind of reduce as much of their negative dependencies on nature, but then also being able to voluntarily invest in the kind of upliftment of biodiversity is such a needed kind of step in today's world. You talked about bringing businesses and kind of the work on biodiversity uplift together in terms of the supply chain and the impacts that they have. Rob, I know that you've been working to bring kind of the landowners and the UK landscape into preparing them for as the biodiversity market in the UK evolves. How have you kind of approached this kind of difficult landscape of connecting the private sector, but also the built industry sector and their impacts on nature?
It's a good question. I think what Biodiversity Net Gain has done more than anything is it has started the conversation. It started joining some of those dots up, potentially quite disparate or seemingly disparate industries, with whether it's farming and development, together in a better way. So what the legislation is doing first and foremost is doing something that wasn't done before properly, which is trying to put a value on the nature that's being impacted. And it's not perfect, and Biodiversity Net Gain, it has its limitations in terms of it uses habitats as a proxy for all of biodiversity, but it does that for very good reasons, and the fact that it works on a development context, a development scale, and it allows you to be able to hold developers to account, or without having to look at species, which can be difficult to track and to pin onto one particular impact. So yeah, first and foremost, that's what the legislation is doing, is it's steering impacts away from high value biodiversity areas, which is what it's meant to do through the mitigation hierarchy. And then there's the opportunity of putting better biodiversity within development sites or picking sites which have opportunities earlier on, rather than trying to retrofit things in. And then finally, it's providing an income stream or a market, emerging market, for landowners to access more finance for projects that maybe don't quite fit into the government schemes or other schemes. So that's what we found at Environment Bank, is it's allowed projects that couldn't get off the ground previously to find a new potential source of income alongside other sources of income that are there from government or wherever it might be. So that's what we've seen, and it's as I said at the start, it's more than anything, it's driven the conversation forward. It's brought more landowners to the table to start exploring projects that they might not have before. It's brought ecologists probably more into the realm of farming and having conversations with farmers about why they're struggling on certain areas of land or what challenges they're facing. So the policy's in its early days, but I think what it does more than anything is it shows how implementing a policy drives demand and drives conversations forward, I think, more than anything.
No, definitely. And you mentioned, BNG using habitat as a proxy. I think this would be a question to the whole panel. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there's a scope to go beyond? Rob, you have mentioned already that this is, a good starting point. Do you see a time where, maybe we get more granular? There's a need to kind of get more granular when we talk about measuring biodiversity, or do you think it creates complexities that the BNG is kind of simplifying by taking habitat as a proxy?
Yeah, I'll quickly finish on that point, and then I'll let the rest of the panel jump in, because I'm sure there's loads of this is a hot topic and something that's discussed a lot. And I think, I'm an ecologist. We often have a tendency to want to measure everything and count everything, and like we're labeling up for an arc or something like that. And the reality is that when you do that, you just bring in potentially more questions and more challenges. And yeah, as I said, BNG uses habitats, so it doesn't include species level indicators within the metric, but that's not to say that you can't bring them into the wider strategy when you're planning a project or whatever it might be. So the reason habitats was chosen was that they are within a development context. It kind of makes sense because you're impacting on the land on the ground. It's something that the policy was developed so that it could properly hold developers to account for those impacts. So habitats are not moving. So if you bring in birds or something like that, great. But you can imagine if it's a small development in particular and the turtle dove numbers go down or something in an area, then it's very difficult to pin that on that development specifically. So that's why habitats be used as a proxy, and it's not perfect. And I see this as BNG 1.0, even though there's been a few iterations. It's getting it out there, and we're going to look back probably in 5-10 years time as technology advances and we bring in, all this emerging tech, which actually the voluntary sector is playing around with and seeing what works. A lot of that will probably come into the BNG space. So yeah, I'll shut up now and let the others come in on that.
Ida, I see Nick, you've joined us. I'll give you a few minutes to catch up, but yeah, Ida, Ben, if you want to add anything to what Rob's shared.
Thank you. Yeah, this is really interesting. I think BNG is as Rob was describing, using habitat as a proxy for biodiversity, and we know there are really strong correlations between habitat type and condition and the biodiversity that there is, and it needs to be simple enough to be understandable and usable by a wide range of users at this stage. And I think describing it as a 1.1 where other things may be added to it in future as technology progresses is a really nice way of thinking about it. My work with the voluntary market, we're seeing it slightly different trends, and that's because the voluntary market differs from BNG in from some very specific ways. Firstly, it's not really designed to be used as an offsetting mechanism in association with developments. And therefore, it doesn't have that same requirement to be providing exact like-for-like biodiversity for a very specific area. It's more designed to be tradable internationally, and that means you need to think about it in a slightly more complex way, because biodiversity in the UK is very different from biodiversity in the Amazon or in the Antarctic. And therefore, the voluntary biocredits tend to rely more on a sort of basket of measures of biodiversity, one of which might be habitats, but then you might include things like birds, insects, fungi, and so on, usually around about 5, and potentially some measures of ecosystem connectivity or integrity on top of that. And that kind of brings you to the point where you can have some estimate, and a consensus seems to be building around a measure of a roughly 1% uplift per hectare as being a sort of the measure of biodiversity, although there's still quite a lot of discussion out around about that. And it's not fully fungible in that it's not, 1% increase in the UK is not exactly the same as 1% increase in a coral reef somewhere, but it's pretty good in terms of, it's probably as close as we're going to get to allowing that market to develop with some level of robustness. And so, yeah, really interesting challenges, and there's a lot of discussion around it. And I think there's that important distinction in terms of thinking about locally versus globally in terms of how many measures of biodiversity are practical. And of course, as Rob was touching on, having more things you measure, the more complicated and expensive it gets, the more room for error there is. And so we've got some really nice organisations coming out that are helping with validation of those sorts of measures, like the Biodiversity Futures Initiative, and some really good technology advances which should enable non-ecology experts to do a lot of the field data collection, either through things like eDNA or audio or photography with sort of AI identification, and that should bring costs down quite rapidly going into the future.
That's a perfect note to kind of maybe turn towards Nick and Ben. As landowners preparing for the biodiversity kind of market, how have you what's your experience been with, the measurement using habitat as a proxy, and in general, your experience with BNG and biodiversity measurements?
I mean, I think Rob's point that this is, version 1.0 is probably a good way to think of it. Habitat, from a practical point of view, does seem to be a good proxy, and certainly once you provide the habitat, you start to get the the species. But from a landowner's and land manager's point of view, it's really easily understandable. It's something we've been doing for decades to a greater or lesser extent, providing habitat. We can see it and we know how to create it. I think if I'd been entering this BNG journey, having to do sort of, I don't know, your eDNAs and your audio recording and stuff, you just can't understand. You can't predict what the outcomes are going to be. And so you can't quantify the outcomes, and it makes the business case for delivering it really difficult. What we are doing, though, I think, having provided the habitat, we are doing a whole heap of sort of voluntary monitoring, if you like, to see actually what we are getting. But I'd be really nervous if that was part of the means of payment that we're receiving.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Nick, any additional experience you'd like to bring?
Yeah, I think what's fascinating in this discussion is that we're talking about the British Isles, which I think Friends of the Earth said our holding capacity as a population on this group of islands is around 22 million people. So that puts extra pressure on our country, and we've discussed we're not. National parks, in which I work for, one of them, third largest national park in the UK, they're a category 5 landscape, so it's not like Amazon rainforest or Annapurna Range. It's largely been adapted by humans, that interaction with humans. So working with people like Ben very closely on the Ilford estate is that farming has actually created a very rich environment traditionally. So behind you on your background there is downland, and downland has to be grazed by sheep, and it creates this wonderful sward of different species, over 40 species per square metre, orchid species, very, very rich. But what it needs fundamentally, and this is why habitats are so key, is scale. And the other thing, as well as scale, is what we describe now in conservation in the UK as Lawton principles. So bigger, better, more joined up. And as a national park with 1,640 square kilometres, we're very much focused on looking at scale and working with partners to achieve nature recovery. We're looking to create over 33% of space for nature in the South Downs National Park. And we know we can do that. We have to do that working with landowners. We don't own the land, so it's so important for us of building partnerships. And that can be commercial sector, voluntary sector, NGOs. But fundamentally, people like Ben, the landowners, the farmers, are those that have been shaping that landscape for thousands of years. This is a new mechanism. It's a new opportunity. And we're very encouraged by the scope and that scale to achieve nature recovery, not for a 5-year, 10-year agreement, as traditionally stewardship has done, but locking it down for 30 years and beyond. And that, I think, is really important. It's really important for farming, coming away from a production-linked system to now looking at other mechanisms in which we can support the landscape for what a population of, 6 to 8 million are we now in the UK? What that requires: clean water, biodiversity, access, well-being, climate mitigation. These are really key. These are the challenges that are facing us versus what we were facing a little while back. We need to get brighter, cleverer at producing food. But producing food on poor land with lots of inputs isn't the way to go. And that's where we see a real opportunity, working with Ben, getting in there very early as a protected landscape in the UK, and encouraging as much green financing, nature-based solutions as much as possible in this national park.
I love that you mentioned the voluntary kind of investments needed as well, on addition to the regulatory market. I wanted to kind of also start with you, but kind of leave a question which we have from our attendees. The question is there still a space or need for voluntary carbon market if we have a fully functioning, fully regulated biodiversity market? So I think what the question is, is it enough having a regulated compliance market, or do you see the need for voluntary investment into biodiversity to bring it back to the restoration goals that we have? Nick, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, voluntary is really exciting, I think, as well, because we're often approached by lots of different organisations that are keen to contribute in some way and meaningfully. And I think that's locking land into some form that's going to benefit nature, You can give money, you can donate money, but what's it actually going to achieve? And if you can actually sort of say, look, this is going to provide a unit, this is going to be there for a long-term purpose, serving nature. I think that's very attractive, and we're finding a lot of philanthropic donations come to the national park. We have a trust, a charitable arm, and so we look at creating habitat for pollinators, putting in trees, dealing with issues such as ash dieback, and maintaining tree cover and trying to increase it. But more and more, we're talking to SMEs and local businesses, because we've got 10 million population within an hour of this national park. The very high population surrounding, Ben mentioned Brighton and Southampton and Winchester and Eastbourne, population around, and we're only just over an hour from London. Is that companies are sort of saying, look, can we contribute? Can we do something positive? And I think the voluntary sector is going to be something that grows. What's important, and we've already been talking with Ben and with others about, is making sure that it ties in, that we don't create a brand new framework, use the existing framework, but sort of scale it down. So you can buy a B&G credit, it'll be a percentage of that as a voluntary, and according to how many you want. But I think there's room for both. Ben, would you, that's fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, the whole voluntary thing's actually looking really exciting, and I really hope that we can find a way to interact with these people who are keen to invest. And as you say, there's such a lot of people living so close that I think people actually just genuinely want to do something to make it better, or to help make it better.
Perfect. Ben, there's another question that's asked from the audience. What are the kind of incentives or support that would really help you kind of, get started with measuring the uplift in your estate or the work that you're doing for the voluntary carbon credit market? What would those look like?
Well, I think, as Nick mentioned, just being able to use the biodiversity net gain metric as a route into the voluntary market actually is once I realized that was possible, that was like a big light bulb moment, because it gets me, it's something that I can understand, and as I said earlier, it's something quantifiable, and we know that we can deliver that. I mean, I keep looking at some of these other basket of metrics type approaches, and I think there's a place for that, but as I said earlier, it's very hard to actually quantify exactly what the outcomes of that are going to be. Whereas
I think it kind of reflects the need for maybe the sector to kind of improve. Rob was mentioning, we'll have more and more MRV partners and measures to uplift, measure and kind of estimate what the true biodiversity kind of benefit or uplift has been. And once we have that, it's going to be easier for us to kind of measure the basket of metrics approach or go beyond the habitats as a proxy. But you're right. I think starting off kind of going in the same line as what the kind of B&G measures allows kind of similarity, but also homogeneity between the kind of uplift that is being measured for compliance. I think I would love to go to Rob and go back to the previous question on do you think that a voluntary kind of investment space is needed, or do you think, we've kind of captured all of the investment needed from the regulated sector?
So yeah, what the regulated sector, I guess, or the very early days of the regulated sector in terms of the compliance market is showing is that it is driving that investment in already, and it is created a level playing field. It's created rules within which developers know how they have to play, and it's set up for a market. So I think that has shown really clearly what a compliance or regulated market can start to do. And interestingly, it's started other countries around the world, such as the US, for example, looking at the UK and seeing, oh, interesting, maybe this is one of the levers we can use to drive more funding into nature restoration. So I think that has shown that compliance is needed in some way, but we have to be clever and cautious how we approach it. And I think the voluntary sector will have a huge part to play, but it can only take us so far. And I think eventually the the mandation of certain frameworks, I think, will be necessary to drive the real change and the scale of investment that we need. But I think voluntary is definitely a great place to start, and it's just about finding different levers that we can use, and really telling the stories and using nature to tell those positive stories. I mean, nature has it's a huge vehicle in terms of communication and being able to tell those positive stories. And as Nick and Ben hinted to there's already companies wanting to do the right thing and invest in the voluntary space and philanthropically, and we should really lean into that and embrace that where it's coming through. And I think the key thing that is happening is that we're moving to an era of measurement, of showing you're working, I always like to say. So we're moving away from tokenistic donations, philanthropic donations and good PR, to a world which is, no, we want to see what the uplift is. We want to see it's long term, and businesses want that too. And forward thinking businesses that have been doing good stuff for a long time are probably a little bit fed up of getting the same amount of PR as a company that's just doing a little bit of tree planting around the corner from their offices or something, if they're doing large scale nature recovery projects. So I like to say that it's still a philanthropic world and voluntary world at the moment, but we're moving to an era of showing you're working and of accountability and of greenwashing free projects which actually have tangible benefits, I guess.
That's perfect. And actually, I was about to ask you, we've talked about the market, and you just mentioned that, it can't be tokenistic. It needs to be long lasting and permanent. Can I ask, how do you maybe how would our audiences identify a high quality project, biodiversity project, whether it's in the UK and Ida for you, maybe, worldwide as well? How would you maybe, what would be some of the qualities that you would want to see in a high quality biodiversity project?
Thank you. Yes, so really important, I think, is having a really robust baseline and understanding your timescales, how practical the implementation of your plan is, and just really the basics like that, having some form of verification. So we've got BNG, which Rob is really well versed on and talked very fluently around. On the voluntary side of things, I mean, in the UK, I sit in Scotland. We don't have a mandatory BNG in Scotland yet. So some councils are using that approach, but also we're looking at the voluntary market and some of the verification standards around that. I think it's quite interesting thinking back to the discussion we've just had around the carbon markets and biodiversity and the interplay between those, particularly with a lot of the clients that I'm working on with and their ESG, their climate reporting targets and so on, and thinking about how finance from that can also benefit biodiversity, because that carbon market and that reporting has been something that companies have come to understand over several decades now. And so they're a bit more comfortable in thinking about it, putting money behind it. And it's easy for them to understand carbon, because a ton of carbon here is the same ton of carbon anywhere else, whereas biodiversity is a bit more complicated. But you do see situations where what corporates are investing in terms of climate might be perverse in terms of their outcomes for biodiversity. For example, if they're planting monocultures of some sort of tree on good habitats. And so we want to steer away from that. And I think one of the really big opportunities for biodiversity where there could be finance at scale is by working with corporates through their climate targets to generate biodiversity and to make sure that is a measured uplift in biodiversity. It might not be a separate biodiversity credit, it could be bundled, so to speak, as the terminology goes. So you'd have your carbon credit associated with a measured uplift in biodiversity, and making sure that has a robust baseline with a measured outcome.
That's perfect. Ida, you did mention, we need to be aware of, you brought down carbon credits and the carbon projects into the discussion. And in the last year, I think the carbon market has had a significant kind of lack of investment because of the quality issues and the kind of issues in project delivery and impact that we saw. How important do you think that the biodiversity credit market, whether it's voluntary, whether it's regulatory, maintains the integrity, and how is that fundamental to making sure that this market takes off?
I think that's absolutely critical. I mean, as you say, we've seen sort of a lull in the carbon market because of some of the practices that have been going on, that not by all means by all actors, but by enough for confidence in that market to have decreased, and has raised some really important issues that the carbon market is learning from, and the biodiversity market is trying to design itself to avoid, for example, via organisations such as the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which is helping to provide guidance and standards for the biocredit market to follow, and in particularly around issues such as additionality, which is, for example, whether or not the carbon would or biodiversity would have been sequestered sort of under a business usual scenario. So it's a particular project with a problem with avoided loss projects, where someone might say, I'm saving this much carbon because I didn't cut down this wood, but then you might look at it and find actually the wood was on a cliff and it was never going to be cut down anyway. Or permanence, which is to do, we've touched on before, I think Nick or Ben talked about the timescale of projects. So can you guarantee how long that's going to be around for? It's a particular issue where you've got big land holdings that might change land ownership during the lifetime of a project. And then thinking about issues like leakage, so that's the displacement of negative impacts from your site onto a surrounding area, maybe locally, maybe further away. So you might see a positive outcome within your site, but actually the overall outcome of that project might be neutral or even negative at a bigger scale. So there's a lot to think about, and I think making sure that those project plans and when you get to that on the ground implementation, that all of that is covered off before a project can be verified and the credits from that sold will be absolutely critical to confidence in that market growing.
I think you've raised a lot of critical points there, and I think the hope is that the biodiversity market takes a look at the carbon market and the mistakes we've made and the learnings we're making as a community in the last year, and we kind of build on the lessons, build on the learnings, and make sure that the market, when it matures, when it's ready, is able to kind of deliver real long-term uplifts, and we are able to show that. We'd obviously need a lot of support. You mentioned Biodiversity Credit Alliance and actors such as project landowners, actors from various areas. Environment Bank has been a leading actor in that space. So I think it'll need a lot of holistic kind of hand-holding and community and team support. But we are very confident that the biodiversity uplift work that we've been working on takes kind of the lessons and is able to kind of meet the requirements that we need to restore the biodiversity in the UK, but also globally. We are at time. We thank the attendees for your questions. If there were any questions that were not answered and you would like us to reach out to our panelists for more of an in-depth answer, please reach out to us. But thank you so much to our panelists for taking our time on a very, very busy Monday today. I think I've really enjoyed our discussion, and I think our audiences all did too. We thank you for your time, and we will close the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.